The champagne flute felt impossibly cold in my hand, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the grand ballroom. Hundreds of the city's elite mingled under crystal chandeliers, their laughter echoing off the marble floors of my father's estate. It was the annual Vancorp gala, but this year was different. This year was a celebration of my father, Richard Vancorp, and his crowning achievement, leveraging the entire family fortune on a single, explosive tech stock bubble. From the corner where I was expected to stand silently, I watched him on the dais, his arm around his perfectly coiffed second wife, Eleanor. My stepsister, Charlotte, stood beside them, preening in a couture gown that cost more than my yearly salary. "To the future!" Richard boomed into the microphone, his voice thick with self-congratulation. "A future where Vancorp isn't just a name, but a dynasty." The crowd roared its approval. They raised their glasses, toasting my family's genius, their audacity. They toasted the very financial instruments that I knew, with absolute certainty, would be worthless by morning. I saw the triumphant sneer Eleanor shot in my direction, a look that said, "See? This is what you'll never be a part of." Charlotte giggled, whispering something to her mother that made them both look at me with undisguised pity and contempt. I simply smiled back, a small, private upturn of my lips, and took a slow sip of the cheap champagne they always served me. They mistook my silence for envy. They thought my calm was resignation. They had no idea that I wasn't just watching their party. I was attending their wake. In my previous life, I had screamed, I had begged, I had shown them the data, the market volatility, the analyst reports that screamed danger. They had called me a fool, a jealous child who couldn't stand to see her father succeed without her sainted mother. They had locked me in my room to stop me from talking to their investors. When the market inevitably crashed, taking their empire and everyone else's savings with it, they didn't hesitate. They forged my signature, shifted the blame, and threw me to the wolves. I died in a cold prison cell, a scapegoat for their greed, with the news of my father's strategic asset protection in tax havens as my final eulogy. But then, I woke up. Not in a cold cell, but in my childhood bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. It was my 18th birthday, 10 years before the crash. A decade to plan, a decade to remember every slight, every stolen inheritance, every whispered cruelty, a decade to prepare. This time, I wouldn't warn them. I wouldn't try to save them. This time, I would simply watch them fly as close to the sun as they dared, knowing I was the one who would be waiting to buy up the ashes for pennies on the dollar. As Richard finished his speech, my phone vibrated silently in my clutch. A single encrypted message from my broker in Zurich. "Position set, awaiting market open." I raised my glass a little higher, a silent toast of my own, not to their future, but to mine, the one I had died to reclaim. My first life was a masterclass in suffering. I was born Ilara Vancorp, daughter of Richard Vancorp and the brilliant astrophysicist Althea Roslin. My mother was the true heart of our family, the source of its warmth and its initial fortune. Her patents, the fruits of a mind that saw poetry and cosmic dust, had been the bedrock upon which Richard built his corporate shell. But my mother was a gentle soul in a world of sharks, and my father was the greatest shark of all. She died when I was 6. A tragic boating accident, the papers said. I remembered the storm, but I also remembered the vicious argument she and Richard had the night before, her voice for the first time sharp with accusation about a woman named Eleanor. 6 months later, Eleanor was my stepmother, and her daughter Charlotte, 2 years my senior, was my stepsister, and my life as I knew it ended. The change was both swift and insidious. My mother's portraits were moved to the attic. Her library of scientific journals was replaced with fashion magazines. I, once the cherished daughter, became a ghost in my own home, a living reminder of a past my father was desperate to erase. Eleanor was a virtuoso of emotional cruelty. She never laid a hand on me. Her weapons were far more precise. She'd compliment Charlotte's mediocre report card in front of me after I'd brought home a perfect score, adding with a sigh, "Some people are just naturally gifted, darling. Others, well, they have to try so hard." She'd lose my invitations to friends' parties, forget to buy me a dress for school dances, and then chide me for being antisocial. My father, caught in Eleanor's web, was a willing accomplice. He saw my pain as an inconvenience, my grief for my mother as a stubborn refusal to move on. He craved the effortless social grace Eleanor provided, the way she made their lives shiny and new, and he resented me for carrying the weight of what he'd discarded. Charlotte learned from her mother's example and added her own brand of sadism. She was the golden child, beautiful, popular, and utterly vapid. My intelligence was a threat to her, so she sought to undermine it at every turn. In high school, I spent a year developing a complex science project on cellular regeneration, a topic inspired by my mother's work. Charlotte, who couldn't tell a mitochondria from a midichlorian, stole my research notes the night before the fair. She presented my work as her own and won a national scholarship. When I confronted her, with proof in my early drafts, Eleanor and Richard defended her. "Alara, darling, you must have been confused," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Charlotte has been working on this for ages. It's ugly to be so jealous." My father just looked away, muttering about my overactive imagination. That was the day I stopped crying. Tears were a currency they didn't value. They controlled every aspect of my life. My mother had left me a substantial trust fund, meant to be mine on my 18th birthday. Richard, as the executor, invested it into Vancorp. When I asked for a statement, he'd pat my head and say, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about finances. It's all part of the family legacy." That legacy meant I was given a meager allowance while Charlotte was given a new sports car for her 16th birthday. I wore secondhand clothes while she had a closet overflowing with designer labels. They sent me to a mediocre state college while she attended an Ivy League school, her tuition paid for by my mother's money. The final betrayal, the one that led to my death, was the culmination of their life's work in cruelty. In the weeks leading up to the great market crash, Vancorp was more leveraged than ever. Richard and Eleanor had become drunk on their own success, making increasingly risky bets. They executed a series of illegal short sells using insider information, a move so blatant it was bound to attract regulatory attention. I discovered the evidence, and in a last foolish attempt to appeal to my father's conscience, I presented it to him. I thought naively that he wouldn't risk prison. He looked at the files, then at me, and I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. The next day, a new account was opened in my name. All the illegal trades were routed through it. When the market crashed and the SEC came knocking, the entire fraudulent trail led directly to me. My father, with Eleanor at his side, gave a tearful press conference about his wayward, troubled daughter who had betrayed the family's trust. I was arrested. They posted no bail. They hired no lawyer for me. They let me rot. The shock and the utter hopelessness were a poison more potent than any other. I gave up. Waking up on my 18th birthday was a violent, disorienting rebirth. The first thing I saw was the date on my alarm clock. 10 years. I had been given back 10 years. For a full day, I was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it. I locked myself in my room, reliving the agony, the betrayal, the cold finality of my last moments. The hate was a living thing, a burning star in my chest. But as the sun set on that first day of my second chance, the hate began to cool, to sharpen, to crystallize into something far more dangerous: purpose. The old Ilara, the girl who craved their approval and wept for their affection, was dead. In her place was a woman who remembered the future, a woman who knew their every weakness, their every sin. I wouldn't just survive this time, I would prevail. My advantage wasn't just foreknowledge of a stock crash. It was a decade's worth of their playbook, committed to memory. I knew every lie they would tell, every corner they would cut, every person they would betray, and I would use it all against them. That night, I knelt and opened the loose floorboard under my bed where I had hidden my most precious possession: a small velvet box containing the last photograph of my mother and a single, intricate silver locket she had given me. "I'll make them pay, Mom," I whispered into the quiet room. "I'll take back everything they stole from you, from us, I promise." My plan began to form, not as a vague wish for revenge, but as a meticulous step-by-step blueprint for their absolute annihilation. The first phase of my plan was camouflage, To them, I had to remain the same timid, unremarkable Alara they had so carefully molded. I played my part to perfection. I was quiet at the dinner table, I kept my grades just good enough to be ignored, and I feigned a complete lack of interest in the family business. This new meekness disarmed them. They saw it as a final, defeated acceptance of my place in their hierarchy, and it made them careless. While they were busy celebrating Charlotte's latest social triumph or Richard's brilliant acquisitions, I was building my arsenal in the shadows. My first move was securing my own capital. The trust fund my mother left me was still under my father's control, a dragon's hoard I couldn't touch. But I had a more valuable asset: my memory. I knew about the rise of a small, obscure tech startup called Cygnus Innovations. In my first life, I'd read a retrospective article about how its stock had skyrocketed 100-fold in 2 years before being bought out by a major corporation. It was a footnote in financial history, too small and too fast for the big players like Vancorp to have noticed at the time. To me, it was the key. I took the menial summer job they expected of me, working as a clerk at a dusty bookstore. I saved every single dollar, living on instant noodles and tap water. I sold the few pieces of non-sentimental jewelry I had from my maternal grandmother. It was a pittance, just a few $1,000s, but it was enough. Using a carefully anonymized online brokerage account, I funneled all of it into Cygnus stock. Then, I waited. For 2 years, I played the part of the dutiful, uninspired daughter while my hidden investment grew with astronomical speed. Meanwhile, I became a student of my enemies. I started offering to help my father's assistant with filing, a task so beneath Charlotte that she openly sneered at the idea. But in that filing room, I had access to everything: deal memos, investment prospectuses, private emails. Richard was too arrogant to believe anyone would dare to read. I learned the intricacies of their corporate structure, the names of their bankers, the locations of their offshore accounts. I was their ghost, absorbing their secrets, my mind a silent ledger of their vulnerabilities. I installed a simple keylogger on the main family computer, the one Eleanor used for her charity accounts, which I quickly discovered were nothing more than elaborate fronts for her personal slush fund. My growing knowledge allowed me to subtly nudge them towards their doom. When Richard mused aloud about diversifying into stable, long-term bonds, I would accidentally leave a magazine open on the coffee table and issue trumpeting the infinite potential of the burgeoning tech sector, specifically praising the very stocks I knew would form the epicenter of the crash. "Oh, I was just reading this for a class, Father," I'd say innocently if he asked. "It seems like everyone is getting so rich from these new companies." I watered the seeds of his own greed. To a man like Richard, the idea that his quiet, simple daughter could accidentally stumble upon a golden opportunity was intoxicating. It fed his ego. He saw it not as my insight, but as his own genius for recognizing the potential in a stray comment. The day Cygnus Innovations was bought out, my secret brokerage account swelled to a staggering sum. It was more money than I had ever dreamed of, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But I wasn't interested in comfort. I was interested in justice. I didn't touch a dime of it. Instead, I moved the entire amount to a newly created shell corporation in Switzerland, registered under a proxy. I called it Phoenix Holdings. The final years leading up to the crash were a masterclass in patience. I watched them become more and more reckless, leveraging every asset, borrowing heavily to pour more fuel on the tech fire. Charlotte, having graduated with a degree in art history that she never used, was given a cushy VP of marketing position at Vancorp. Her sole contribution was redesigning the company logo and throwing lavish parties, all while drawing a 7-figure salary. Eleanor was siphoning funds into her offshore accounts, a safety net she thought only she knew about. I logged every transaction. My turning point from passive observer to active predator came a year before the end. At a family dinner, Richard announced he was mortgaging the ancestral home, the house my mother had lovingly restored, to secure one final massive loan. He was going all in. He wanted to triple his position in Omnitech, the linchpin of the entire bubble. This was the move that, in my past life, had ensured their ruin was absolute. Charlotte clapped with delight, already planning how to spend the imaginary profits. Eleanor gazed at my father with adoration. I felt a cold fury settle in my soul. That house was my mother's legacy. It was the last piece of her they hadn't completely tainted, and now they were gambling it away. That night, I made the call. I contacted a discreet, fiercely loyal private banker in Zurich that I had identified through my research. I gave him my instructions. On the specified date, Phoenix Holdings would execute the largest leveraged short position he could secure against a single company, Vancorp, and by extension, every tech stock it was tied to. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. My decision was made. I would no longer just be a victim preparing for her moment. I would be the architect of their downfall, using their own greed as my primary weapon. The night of the Vancorp gala was the crescendo of a decade of their hubris and my silent, patient fury. Standing in that ballroom, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a play for which I had already read the final tragic act. Every fawning compliment directed at my father, every toast to his vision, was another nail in their collective coffin. When he formally announced on stage that Vancorp had successfully leveraged the last of its assets to acquire a controlling stake in Omnitech, the room erupted in applause. It was the single most foolish financial decision in the company's history, and they were celebrating it as a coronation. My father, high on the adoration of the crowd, finally made his way over to me. Eleanor and Charlotte flanked him like vultures in silk and diamonds. "Well, Alara," he began, his tone condescending. "Not so talkative tonight. Finally realized you're better off leaving the important decisions to those of us who understand how the world works." "I understand perfectly, Father," I said, my voice even. Eleanor let out a tinkling, malicious laugh. "Darling, she's probably just overwhelmed. All these numbers and big ideas must be terribly confusing for her." "Don't you worry, dear. Once the profits from this deal come in, we'll make sure to increase your allowance," Charlotte chimed in, looking me up and down with disdain. "Maybe you can finally buy a dress that isn't from a department store. Honestly, Alara, it's embarrassing." In my first life, these words would have shattered me. Now, they were nothing. They were the meaningless chirps of birds about to be consumed by a hurricane. I simply met my father's gaze. "Are you certain this is wise, Father? The market seems volatile." It was the faintest echo of the warnings I had screamed in my past life, and the effect was immediate. His face hardened. "Wise?" he spat, his voice low and venomous so the nearby guests wouldn't overhear. "I have built an empire, while you have done nothing but take up space in my house. You know nothing of wisdom. This deal will secure the Vancorp name for a century. It is my legacy, and you will not be a part of it. After tonight, your access to the family accounts is terminated. Your allowance is cut off. You are, for all intents and purposes, on your own. Consider it my final gift to you. The chance to finally stand on your own 2 feet, though I suspect you'll fall. It was the disinheritance I had known was coming, the one that had devastated me before. This time, I just nodded slowly. I see. Well, I wish you the best of luck, Father. You'll need it." His eyes narrowed, searching my face for the tears he expected, for the begging he craved. He found none. He found only a calm, placid lake, and the emptiness of my reaction infuriated him more than any outburst could have. He turned on his heel and stormed away, his trophy wife and daughter scurrying after him. I stayed for another hour, a silent witness to their final moments of glory. At midnight, I slipped out unnoticed. I went not to my sterile room in their mansion, but to a penthouse suite at the Four Seasons that I had booked under an alias, paid for in cash. From the window, I could see the glittering Vancorp Tower, a monument to their arrogance. I took out my encrypted satellite phone and opened the live feed from my Zurich trading desk. The Asian markets were opening in a few hours, the first domino to fall. My positions were locked in. Every single dollar Phoenix Holdings had was betting on the catastrophic failure of my family. I had shorted Vancorp. I had bought put options on Omnitech and every one of its suppliers. I had created a financial weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at the heart of their world. As I watched the city lights, I felt no glee, no joy. only a profound and terrible sense of peace. The justice my mother never received, the justice I was denied, was about to be served. The sun would rise in the morning, and their world would be set on fire. The crash wasn't a gentle decline, it was a cliff. The Tokyo Exchange opened, and Omnitech, plagued by a sudden, unexpected, to them report of fraudulent accounting practices, plummeted by 60% in the first 5 minutes. The panic was instantaneous and contagious. By the time the European markets opened, it was a full-blown rout. Vancorp stock, inextricably tied to Omnitech, didn't just fall, it evaporated. I watched it all from my hotel suite, a pot of jasmine tea steaming beside me. News channels were a cacophony of panicked anchors and weeping analysts. The ticker at the bottom of the screen was a river of red. It was a bloodbath. My phone buzzed incessantly with updates from my broker. Plus $50 million, plus $120 million, plus $300 million. My short positions were paying out on a scale that was almost absurd. I was making more money per minute than I had earned in a lifetime of menial jobs. By the time Wall Street opened, it was already over. Vancorp was in freefall. Margin calls were triggered, but they had no liquidity. Every asset was leveraged. There was nothing to sell. I watched my father on TV, ambushed by reporters outside the Vancorp tower. The confident, booming titan from the night before was gone. In his place was a pale, trembling old man, his face a mask of disbelief. Eleanor was beside him, her perfect makeup ruined by tears, screaming at the cameras. Charlotte was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding. "This is a temporary fluctuation," Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "Market fundamentals are strong. Vancorp is strong." But he was lying, and everyone knew it. The empire was hollow. The dynasty was dead. Within 48 hours, the Vancorp board, what was left of it, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Their creditors, the very banks that had celebrated my father's genius, descended like sharks. The liquidation began. Their cars were repossessed. Their accounts were frozen. Their credit cards were declined. The private jets, the yachts, the vacation homes, all seized. For a week, I let them twist in the wind. I let them experience the powerlessness they had inflicted on me for a lifetime. I heard through back channels that they were holed up in the mansion, the one asset protected from immediate seizure by homestead laws, fielding calls from furious investors and dodging process servers. They were trapped, tasting the first bitter dregs of a poverty they had always believed was a condition reserved for lesser people. Then, I made my move. Through my lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, a stern, impeccably dressed man who knew only that he worked for the enigmatic head of Phoenix Holdings, I began to act. Phoenix Holdings made offers to Vancorp's primary creditors. We offered to buy their debt, all of it, for pennies on the dollar. To the panicked banks, desperate to recoup any fraction of their losses, the offer was a godsend. They sold. In a series of swift, brutal transactions, Phoenix Holdings became the sole creditor of the Vancorp estate. I owned their debt. I owned them. The final act was set for a Tuesday morning. Mr. Abernathy, accompanied by sheriff's deputies and a team of movers, arrived at the gates of the Vancorp mansion. He presented the foreclosure notice. With Phoenix Holdings now owning the mortgage, their flimsy homestead protection was void. They had 24 hours to vacate the premises. I timed my own arrival for the following day at noon. I chose a car they would recognize with a sickening sense of irony. A vintage Bentley, the exact model my mother had always wanted and my father had always called frivolous. As I drove up the long, winding driveway, I saw them on the front lawn, surrounded by a pathetic pile of suitcases and boxes. They looked lost, broken. Richard's expensive suit was rumpled, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Eleanor's face was a blotchy mess, her hair in disarray. Charlotte was sitting on a Louis Vuitton trunk, weeping. I parked the car and stepped out. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a sharp, impeccably tailored suit of deep crimson, the color of power and blood. For a moment, they just stared, their brains unable to process what they were seeing. To them, I was still the girl in the faded jeans, the ghost at their feast. "Ilara," my father whispered, his voice raspy. "What are you doing here? Have you come to gloat?" "Gloating is beneath me, father," I said, my voice cool and clear. echoing slightly in the stunned silence. "I've come to inspect my property." Eleanor's head snapped up. "Your property? Don't be ridiculous, you foolish girl. We've lost everything. The house is being seized by some vulture investment firm." Mr. Abernathy, who had been waiting for my arrival, stepped forward. "Allow me to introduce you," he said in his crisp, formal tone. "Mr. and Mrs. Vancorp, Miss Vancorp. This is the sole proprietor and CEO of Phoenix Holdings." The blood drained from their faces. The comprehension dawned not as a slow realization, but as a violent physical blow. Richard staggered back, his hand clutching his chest. Eleanor let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. Charlotte just stared, her mouth agape, tears forgotten. "You?" Richard breathed, the word laced with horror and disbelief. "How?" I walked slowly towards them, my heels clicking on the gravel. I stopped just before him, forcing him to look at me. Not as a daughter, not as a ward, but as the new master of his universe. "You taught me, Father," I said softly. "You taught me that money is power. You taught me that sentiment is a weakness. You taught me that in the world of business, there is no room for family, only for winners and losers. I was just a better student than you ever imagined." I turned my gaze to Eleanor. "Remember when you sold my mother's locket to pay for Charlotte's riding lessons? You said it was a frivolous trinket. This house was my mother's home. You used it as a bargaining chip. Now it's mine. I believe that's what they call a return on investment." I let the silence hang, letting them absorb the full, crushing weight of their new reality. They had not just been beaten by the market. They had been surgically dismantled by the victim they had created. Their ruin wasn't an accident of fate. It was a carefully orchestrated masterpiece of revenge. And I was the artist. The empire they had built on my mother's bones and my stolen future was now mine, bought and paid for with the pennies they had left behind. The aftermath was a quiet, methodical erasure of their legacy and the reclamation of my own. The Vancorp name, now synonymous with fraud and catastrophic failure, was dissolved. From its ashes, I rebuilt the company as Phoenix Holdings. I rehired many of the loyal, low-level employees my father had cast aside over the years, promoting based on merit, not nepotism. We moved away from the high-risk, predatory speculation that had been Richard's lifeblood and focused on sustainable, ethical investments, including funding scientific research through a new foundation I named after my mother, the Althea Roslin Institute. The company didn't just recover, it thrived, built on a foundation of integrity they could never have understood. The mansion, their gaudy palace of stolen wealth, was the first thing I cleansed. I had every piece of Eleanor's ostentatious furniture removed and donated. I reopened my mother's library, restoring her collection of books and scientific instruments. Her portrait was returned to its place of honor above the grand fireplace. The house ceased to be a symbol of their greed and became a sanctuary, a quiet testament to the woman they had tried to erase. I found peace in its halls, a sense of belonging I had been denied my entire life. As for them, their fall was as complete as my rise. They were left with nothing, absolutely nothing. The offshore accounts Eleanor had so carefully curated, I had the transaction records. An anonymous tip to the IRS led to a massive investigation into tax evasion and fraud. She was arrested trying to flee the country with a bag of jewelry. Stripped of her wealth and social standing, the cruelty that had been her defining feature curdled into madness. She spent her remaining days in a state-run psychiatric facility, ranting about the daughter who had stolen her life. Charlotte, who had never worked an honest day, found the world to be a cold, unforgiving place without the Vancorp name to open doors for her. Her reputation was in tatters. No one would hire the disgraced daughter of a ruined tycoon. Her wealthy friends abandoned her overnight. The last I heard, she was working as a waitress in a roadside diner 2 states away. Her beauty faded by bitterness and cheap gin, forever haunted by the life she felt she was entitled to. And my father, Richard. He was the most broken of all. He wasn't imprisoned. I made sure of that. Prison would have been an ending. I wanted him to live with what he had done. He was penniless, unemployable, and utterly alone. He tried to sue me, but he had no grounds. I had broken no laws. I had simply used his own avarice against him. He was a ghost in a city that once worshipped him, occasionally spotted on a park bench, a hollowed out man staring at the glittering tower that now bore the Phoenix logo. One cold autumn afternoon, years later, he showed up at the gates of the mansion. He was gaunt, dressed in a threadbare coat. He begged the security guard to let him speak to me. Out of a final morbid curiosity, I agreed. We met on the grand portico, the same spot where he had last stood as master of the house. He didn't rage or accuse. He simply looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow. "Why, Alara?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I was your father. Why couldn't you have just warned me?" I looked at this pathetic shell of a man and felt nothing. No pity, no anger, not even the ghost of the love I once craved. "I did," I said, my voice as calm as the autumn air. "In another life I did. I begged you to listen, and in return, you destroyed me. This time, I just decided to get a better return on my investment." I turned and walked back into my house, my mother's house, and left him standing there in the cold, a relic of a past I had not only survived, but conquered. The cycle was broken. Justice, in the end, was not about an eye for an eye. It was about taking everything and building something better from the ruins. And I was finally completely at peace.